Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started shortly. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started shortly. We ask that you mute your microphones. You should be muted when you come in, but if you're not, please mute your microphones. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of Reimagining Religious Freedom. As you can see, we are in a Zoom room, so I want to invite you to mute yourself if you're not muted. Additionally, I'm going to ask Mike if you could spotlight my video, because I'm seeing someone else on the front of the screen there. Thank you. Yes. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Are we good? Thank you for joining us for today's sessions of Reimagining Religious Freedom. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent. I am the curator for this Religious Freedom Mobile Institute, and we're partnered with the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, as well as the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative at Vanderbilt Divinity School. So before we get started this morning, I just want to bring you greetings from the native lands that I occupy near the nation's capital, which are Anacostan lands. And we acknowledge that this is Native American Heritage Month, and we want to celebrate the beautiful fabric of their stories and their culture and their history that they bring to us here in the United States. And also remember that there's still more work that needs to be done to protect sacred lands and to make sure that the rights of everyone are protected here in the United States. And so again, I just want to welcome you and thank you for being with us today. At the same time, I would like to acknowledge at the beginning of this conference that unfortunately, Dr. Teresa Smallwood will not be with us today. She unfortunately had a loss in her family of a beloved family member. And so we are holding her in our higher conscience and thoughts as she travels out of state and also eulogizes her family member this morning. So I just want to acknowledge that Dr. Teresa is the reason why we're all gathered here today, because this virtual conference is Reimagining Religious Freedom is hosted and partnered. We've partnered with Vanderbilt Divinity School to do this work, and she reached out to us and asked if we would convene this gathering. And so we reached out to our friends that you will hear from today, like Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, Reverend Charles Watson Jr., and Rahmah Abdulaleem, and a host of others that you'll hear throughout the day today. And so we're really excited and thankful for all of our partners. If you saw the slides, you saw that we're partnered with Vanderbilt Divinity School, as I mentioned already, the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, but also KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and the Center for Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary. So, and this event would not be possible without the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation. So we're grateful to them for supporting this important work and the work that is happening at Vanderbilt. So, and I also want to have lots of announcements up front that I want to do. So I also want to thank those that are working behind the scenes that you cannot see. Mike Frontero, who is with Union Presbyterian Seminary, who has generously donated the use of their Zoom account for us to convene today, as well as last evening. We also have Ms. Sophie Hersher with Grandview Strategies, as well as Victoria Hamilton, who are working behind the scenes and checking the chat, and will be responding to you if you have any questions. So with that in mind, I also want to share a few housekeeping things with you. As I mentioned to those that were on earlier, we are in a Zoom meeting. So we could see you, you could see us. We ask that you keep your microphones muted until the time of Q&A. And also for the time of small group discussions. It's very important that everyone is able to hear the presenters clearly. So we appreciate you abiding by those guidelines. And we encourage you to tweet on social media. Let people know what's happening today. We're using the hashtag ReimagineRF 2021. So that's hashtag ReimagineRF 2021, and you can use any of the handles that you see for any of our sponsors that will show on the screen or showed on the slides earlier. We can put those in the chat, but you can also search for those on social media as well. So with that, I want to say thank you all for joining us. And just to get us started, we're going to start with our 10 a.m. session, Reframing Christian Nationalism. Reframing Religious Freedom, Confronting Christian Nationalism. So this conversation, I'm delighted to have with us today some of our thought partners and colleagues that are doing the work in their respective spaces. And so I want to invite them to be on screen with me right now. And so first we have with us Rahmah Abdulaleem, as I mentioned, who is the executive director of KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. She is a native of Philadelphia, and she is a licensed attorney, and she has been doing incredible work on human rights issues, not only in the United States, but also addressing issues around the world. She is also actively engaged in her community, even as a Girl Scout leader. So I find it so amazing, and I'm delighted that Rahmah is with us today. Welcome, Rahmah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Then we have with us Dr. Corey D.B. Walker. Dr. Corey Walker is the president of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, which is located in Richmond, Virginia. Additionally, Dr. Walker is the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities at Wake Forest University. He's quite a brilliant scholar and published author and sought after speaker. Dr. Walker is the contributing author and editor of the book African Americans and Religious Freedom, as well as Rahmah were both a part of this project. that we released this book in January of 2021, which was funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, but supported and published by under the leadership of the Freedom Forum Institute. And so we're grateful to have you with us, Dr. Walker. I know that you will not be able to have too much time with us this morning, so we're delighted that you're with us now.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. And finally, we have Charles Watson Jr., who is the Director of Education at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Charles is a native of Millen, Georgia, but he's also, we salute you, Charles, a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. And so, Charles, we're delighted that you're with us. But Charles has also served as a children's hospice chaplain. And so I know that Charles has a lot to contribute to this conversation. You will hear from him not only today, but also tomorrow during the advocacy training. So make sure you put that on your schedule as well. Charles, welcome.
Thank you. Just glad to be here. You know,
we're delighted that you're with us.
You know, I'm still ordinary people. So
you're extraordinary, like all the panelists and the attendees that are here. So this is going to be a conversation with friends. Right, we're talking about reframing conversations about religious freedom. As you can see, for some reason, I want to jump straight to Christian nationalism. But Corey, I'm going to start with you by asking the question, like, why is it important for us to have this conversation today? What is the significance of this conversation in this moment in time, and especially the involvement of faith communities to take action?
Well, Sabrina, I think this is one of the more critical conversations that we need to have that moves across faith communities, indeed, that moves across our entire democratic polity. What we're witnessing right now is the mobilization of religious hatreds in order to colonize political power. And that political power is seeking to exclude those who don't identify with those ascendant norms that are seeking an authoritarian ethos in the United States. So when we think about Christian nationalism, we're looking at a conflict of sovereignties, sovereignties between the nation state and it's the sovereign of citizens, as well as the sovereignty of particular belief systems, and those belief systems that seek to hold their ultimate commitments to be the only ultimate commitments of the nation state. And so where we're melding those two systems together, those two competing sovereignties, we have to begin to understand that then mitigates our democratic ethos. It then mitigates and marginalizes various citizens who don't adhere to those ultimate claims and commitments. And more importantly, it erodes the very fabric of solidarity that's needed in a moment of global protest, global pandemic, and the need to refound public policy to ensure that the lives and life chances of so many individuals, not only within America, but across the world, can live up to their aspirations and to affirm the worth, value, and dignity of all individuals. In our contemporary moment, this conversation is vitally important because as we see with certain issues in the public square, from reproductive rights to voting rights to questions around who is legitimately a citizen, as well as questions around immigration, the mobilization of religious identities and religious hatreds are being deployed in order to divide and to also usurp the ability of American democracy to respond effectively to these pressing challenges. When we think of this moment of the mobilization of a Christian nationalism, of course, we have earlier moments within American history of the mobilization of Christian nationalism. We can look at the ways in which Christian nationalism usurped the idea of religious freedom at the founding of the American nation. You can look at the ways in which religious nationalism melded with certain forms of nostalgia in the Old South and its lost cause. House. You can look at the ways in which certain forms of Christian nationalism melded with the state to fight the New Deal programs, and also that then in the wake of World War II really generated the trends that we see with Christian nationalism, beginning with the Eisenhower administration, and of course, deepening with the Nixon administration, and of course, with Reagan, moving us all the way to the right, to the moment that we have now, where we're actually seeing the fulfillment of these visions across a broad array of public policy. So what we're seeing is really a long-term trend, but the necessity to then combat this trend is the necessity to begin to re-articulate what a broad, inclusive religious freedom could mean, what an understanding of religious freedom that protects and affirms the worth, value, and dignity of all citizens could mean, the ability of religious freedom to then mobilize resources within a variety of religious traditions and faith traditions and traditions that exceed faith traditions to really confront the challenges that we all face. That's what's needed in this particular moment. And as we're approaching the end of the COP26 meetings, we're all confronting the global crisis that we all confront, every human on the planet, and that is the climate crisis. And we need to be able to mobilize all of our resources to meet that challenge. And there are so many resources within faith communities that can enable us to effectively respond and effectively reframe our societies. But if we don't reframe religious freedom, if we don't reimagine it, the forces of Christian nationalism that are intent on dividing, that are intent on denying the integrity of every human being, that are intent on really destroying the planet through a vicious and virulent assault on the environment, what we can actually witness is the deterioration, the further deterioration of American democracy, as well as the further deterioration of the human condition and the global condition. This conversation is important, not only for us, not only for every faith community. This is an important conversation for every American and for humans across the world.
Wow, Dr. Walker. Yes, yes. You said a mouthful there. And so the thing that stood out to me is you talked about the two competing sovereignties, right? And then you mentioned this broad, inclusive understanding of religious freedom. So I'm going to ask Rahmah to jump in here and just talk about like a little bit more about what is religious freedom? Like to have this broad, inclusive narrative. I often raise the question, whose religious freedom are we talking about, right? So people have, based on, to add to what Dr. Corey said, some people have a narrow way of understanding religious freedom, but Dr. Corey gave us a great understanding and foundation about all the issues that intersect with religious freedom issues. So Rahmah, can you just help us, like, give us a better sense of what is religious freedom? What does religious freedom mean to you?
Thank you, Dr. Dent. What is always fascinating to me is that people have started to use religious freedom as like a dog whistle. You hear religious freedom, you hear religious liberty, and it's a dog whistle to certain parts of the country of, okay, we no longer can discriminate based on race, but if we say it's religious, we can do whatever we want. And so for too many people, people think religious freedom means I can say whatever I want to, as long as whatever I want to and do whatever I want to, as long as I say I have a religious basis. That is not what religious freedom is. And so if anyone is on this meeting today who thinks that as long as I say it's religious, I can do it, that is not what religious freedom is. That was not what the foundation of it was in the Constitution. That was never what it was. But for some reason, we have translated it personally into that's what it means. And the Christian nationalists have taken that baton and have run with it. They started that race with that, and they're like, wow, religious freedom is really the respect for religions, various religions. That goes back to the Establishment Clause. I mean, the Free Exercise Clause. It was not for, you know what, we have this religion that is the American religion, and everything that happens in the US is based on this religion. That is not what religious freedom is. And I think for too many people, they're like, well, we're a Judeo-Christian country and we were brought up on this issue. It's like, no, that's not what those words actually mean. It was for us not to have one state religion. The founding fathers, and they were only fathers and they were only white landowner fathers, they wanted it to not have an established religion. A lot of them came from other places in Europe that they were just like, we don't want to have one established religion. We want people to be able to express their religious expression however they want to express their religious expression. And we want to respect that. And what people have lost in thinking about religious freedom is the respect for other religious expression. We are so focused on our own personal expression that we have lost respect for the other expression. So that is what people are like, oh, free exercise means I can do whatever I want to, when I want to. That is not what the free exercise clause is. The establishment clause means that there is no one religion that is established as a religion of the United States. And the free exercise clause does not say, oh, since there's not one religion, that means that I can just do what I want. That is not what the free exercise clause is all about. And until we as a country really start thinking about what freedom of religion really is and not the dog whistle that we hear, because too often it's like, well, I'm going to pull my children out of public school because they're teaching about other religions. That's the beauty of freedom of religion here in the United States, is that you can learn about other religions. Your child learning yoga is not being told that they have to be Buddhist or Hindu because they're learning yoga. Learning about other religions does not mean, oh, you're trying to impact my child. Like, oh my gosh, if they hear some of the background about any other religion other than what we teach them at our church, mosque, synagogue, whatever our religious organization is, we somehow are impacting children. People need to focus. Religious freedom really means respecting other people. And instead of using it like a sword, which is currently being used, it should be a shield of protection. And so that's why I always tell people, don't use it as a sword. When you see yourself starting to use it as a weapon against others, you need to stop and realize you're using it incorrectly. And there's so many examples throughout history of people using religion as justification for so many things. I mean, we have used religion badly, and we really want to, and in reframing it, taking it back and saying religious is something that's personal to people, but it should not be a weapon. It should be something that is personal and really reflective and helps people stay centered. That's what religion should be all about, and not be, okay, I'm going to use my sword to get everybody.
Thank you so much, Rahmah. Like, you brought up some very important points about religion not being used to harm others, and then also bringing it back to the Constitution, right? That, the thing is that people have the right to freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, and freedom from religion too. So when we think about our free thinking friends, our secular humanists, our atheist friends, like, they have the right to have their beliefs that are not rooted in religion or rooted on faith-based principles. And so to that point, you also raised another thought that I want to bring back Dr. Corey in here before Charles jumps in, because Dr. Corey has to leave. But Dr. Corey, we wrote this book in January, right? Because we did this 3-year project about African-American perspectives on religious freedom. And then we came to the end of the project and we said, oh, we need to write a book, because if it's not written, it never happened, right? So can you tell us more about why this particular text, and you can see it in my background, friends, and you can also download it free of charge. Why is it important that people read this text and get a deeper understanding of this particular topic and the many lenses through which people of African descent engage about religious freedom in this country?
Well, I think it really goes to the point that Rahmah was discussing, that religious freedom is not a sword, it is a shield. And if we want to understand it as a shield, as a mechanism to build deep solidarities between individuals in a political polity, how to deepen the democratic experience, we have to understand the different perspectives on religious freedom, both historically as well as in our contemporary moment, as well as how dominant ideas of religious freedom structure antagonistic forms of politics. What we're do and what we attempted to do in the book is to bring forward some new perspectives on religious freedom that are pitched at a general audience. We wanted to reach congregations and we wanted to reach community members such that religious freedom, the way in which it's being deployed in our public discourse, can then have a number of voices represented in that discourse so that individuals can then enhance their understandings and their perspectives on religious freedom, with the hope that it can deepen our democratic experience and deepen our understanding of religious freedom in a moment where we have a deep and rich pluralistic polity, and also to combat some of the nefarious trends that we see in democratic societies in the United States and across the world. As we see the rise of religious hatreds being mobilized in the US, in Brazil, throughout Eastern Europe, in India, what we also need are the mobilization of new ideas, new imaginaries, and fresh understandings of religious freedom that can deepen democracy in this moment of deep global planetary crisis. So with Rahmah's beautiful and eloquent formulation that religious freedom is not a sword but a shield, we're trying to provide a resource to build modes of solidarity so that shield can be even broader, and the ways in which those modes of solidarity can then enhance our democratic experience and also mitigate the rise of these virulent and vicious and very violent forms of Christian nationalism.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. We appreciate you. We know you have to go. We appreciate the insight and the wisdom that you've brought to this conversation. I'm going to come back to this book, Rahmah, when I talk to you again. But Dr. Corey, thank you so much for being with us today, and safe travels to you. So I want to bring Charles Watson into this conversation because Rahmah talked about religion not being used to discriminate. And Dr. Corey talked about having this broad, inclusive understanding of religious freedom, but also these two competing sovereignties. Now, almost everyone, I'm not assuming everyone did, but almost everyone on this video, this meeting today, probably saw what happened on January 6th, right? And so the imagery that I saw on January 6th raised so many questions for me. There were people that said, oh, this is not the America that I know. I'm like, this is the America that I know. So there are things that happen on there. There were images that were down at the Capitol building and on the grounds there. So there were crosses, there were nooses, there were anti-Semitic things that were there. There was a lot of prejudice and hatred in the tone and the actions of the people that were there. And so I don't have the image. I showed it last night during the presentation. So those that missed last night's presentation, I encourage you to watch it. It will be up on YouTube soon. But with that, like, Charles, can you tell us what is Christian nationalism, right? Because we throw that term around because we do this work, we understand it, but a lot of people don't even understand what Christian nationalism is. Can you speak to Christian nationalism in a way that helps us understand what that looks like or what that translates to for some people that ascribe to their religious beliefs?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dent. You want a two-part answer? You know, I can divide into, I give you the work answer first, and then I give you the Millen, Georgia answer, you know.
Okay.
The work answer is that Christian nationalism is an ideology that tries to put in simple form, to be a good American, you have to be a Christian. And to be a good Christian, you're an American. I mean, that's just a simple form of it, you know, like there's nothing wrong with patriotism. You know, I'm a veteran, and yesterday, Veterans Day, was very symbolic and very, very touching to me. Just my father was a Marine. My brother is still currently in the armed forces. So it means a lot to me. But what means even more is that I was around other people that were different from me. And what we were coming to do was to try to protect those freedoms that everybody should have on the same level. Christian nationalism really doesn't believe that. Christian nationalism believes that unless you are a Christian, then we're tolerating you here in America, and if you're not patriotic, then just leave, and they put them together into a form of saying, not only are you not one of us, we have a right to do something about you if you don't think how we think in this way. The Charles Watson answer of it, Miller Jordan answer, is just white supremacy named in a different way. It's just a cover for those that don't like anything that's not like them. It's not anything new. Dr. Walker was talking about how we label it and the importance of it and what happens. But this is not a new thing. For me, it's just like the doctrine of discovery. And then it was manifest destiny. And now it's just a form of Christian nationalism. It's the chain. It's the same chain link. It's just a different link to it, maybe renamed. And so Rahmah, you bring up the sword, not using a sword. But if we're really honest, in this nation, Christianity has always been used as a sword. When has it not been used as a sword? You can see with some of the work we've been doing at BJC with Voices of Faith Freedom, where we bring in different individuals to talk about what does faith freedom mean to them. In the past week or so, I've had a chance to talk to Reverend Mitch Randall, who's a indigenous people, Native American out in Oklahoma. And we talked about this manifest destiny. We've talked about this idea of, no, Christians thought it was their right to this land. So they used that thought process to say, let's move these people and say, hey, it's not us, this is God ordained. So we've used it as a sword all the time. And sometimes people are more blatant with it. And then certain times it's a little more back. Rahmah, you also brought up, schools. We know that the school choice aspect of it, especially in the South, was, hey, let's get our kids to be able to not be in these integrated schools. And religion was a part of that too. Let's separate. We're not supposed to be together. These things. So religion has always been a sport. And for us, as people that have a faith tradition, we need to be the people that are shields from that. And please don't take this in the wrong way. I'm not trying to say violence in acts of it. I'm saying that we have to be careful not to be so much of the sword that we just continue to just let it keep hitting. We have to find a way to hit back with it. And that way of hitting back is actually defining what these things are, calling them what they are, and then taking action on what people are trying to do. And that is not only just in our voting process or our legislation process, but that is in defending the rights of others and being just as loud. And that January 6th was something that was an image that many people didn't know was out there. Well, they knew, but they didn't want to think that was America. We look at other countries and say, look at these other countries, how they're doing this. Really? It was just a mirror. It was a mirror. And so while I'm not grateful that it happened, I am grateful that we can point at something now and say, you're going to deny this with this in your face? You really going to deny this? So I hope that opened a lot of doors for people to understand how dangerous Christian nationalism can be.
Thank you, Charles. And that's so true. Christian nationalism is a very dangerous thing for people to, is a very dangerous thing. And people need to understand the significance of this conversation today. And so one of the things that I also think about in doing this work is how religious freedom has been used as coded language to discriminate, right? That it happens a lot, and we even see it right now, because Rahmah pointed this out earlier on in the discussion. But even the conversations around vaccine mandates, right, and getting the vaccine, people are leaning into their religious beliefs to say, I shouldn't have to do this because whatever their reason is that pulls in their religious tradition or their belief systems. And that's a concern, because this is a public health crisis and a public health issue. And so there was, I saw earlier this week that there are 2 Southern Baptist schools that are suing to not have, they agree with vaccinations, but they don't agree with the mandates. And so there's so many cases that are happening right now to deal with that. But I want to go back to thinking about this coded language for discrimination. So Rahmah, in chapter 6 of the book, which that chapter is called Race, Religious Pluralism, and Religious Freedom, you talk about this critical moment for African Americans and the devastation of what we saw during COVID-19. And that included like the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and many others that we cannot, and we should name, but we can't name for the length of this conversation that we're having today. That's how many people need to think about. And so to look at this through, there was this global movement that happened when people started shouting out Black Lives Matter, right? It was like Black Lives Matter. There were protests around the world, but then yet we still experience discrimination via religious freedom violation. So I want you to touch on this particular chapter. And although he's not here, I want to raise Reverend Lamar's chapter as well in the book. I just highly recommend everyone gets the book. We put the link in the chat, but his chapter focused on the Black church and also religious freedom in the Black church today. And so for those of you that are not aware, in December of 2020, Reverend Lamar, William H. Lamar, he is the pastor of Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., was targeted by the Proud Boys when their Black Lives Matter sign was taken down off of their property at their church. And so he wrote an article that talked about how it wasn't just a matter of taking down the sign, right? It was this matter of saying, you don't even belong here, right? Your identity. And I tell people, this was a religious freedom violation and racial discrimination, because it wasn't at the public library, right? It was a historic Black church that was targeting that. So Rahmah, to come into this conversation about race and religious pluralism and religious freedom, can you tell us more about what are you seeing right now? What are the experiences that are happening in the public square and the conversations that are happening? And how is KARAMAH weighing in on these conversations? I know you did some work with the Adam Center and her and Essa Faryad to talk about the history, right? The 400 plus years of history behind this. But can you speak to what you've seen historically and contemporary and the conversations that are happening about this issue as it connects to religious freedom?
Well, I just want to really lift up what you said. If you don't read any other chapter in the book, I highly recommend reading chapter 5 with Reverend Lamar, because he makes some excellent points about even adopting the language. Like, does he even like the words religious freedom because of how it connects to how, as African Americans, we are in this country in the first place, and how religion was used as a means of, okay, we can enslave these Africans because they're not Christians. And the idea, I mean, you know, Reverend Smallwood talked about it last night when she was like, the idea that, you know, the white Europeans introduced Christianity to the Africans when Africans knew about Christianity long before we were pulled to this country. So really wrapping those all together and people really discussing it, because another issue that comes up related to religious freedom is why you guys always bringing race into it. And it's because race is so important. That is something that we cannot shake. As Americans, we want to pretend that, oh yeah, we're in this post-racial identity and race doesn't matter. Race does matter. And I have said it before, when people tell me like, oh, when I see you, I don't see race. And I'm like, well, that's a problem. I want you to see me as an African-American. Like that is part of my experience as an American, as being African-American, as being a Muslim African-American. And really, people need to really think about religious freedom so much more broadly, because so many people have, well, religious freedom means that's what white Christians have used. And so, because if they use it this way, that must be the right way to use it. And that does not connect all the time. That is not the connection we want people to make. People come in so many different stripes, and there's so many religious beliefs. And even with Christian nationalism, you know, Reverend Watson really didn't get, you know, like, it's not covering everybody. All Christians aren't created equal. There's some, you're not Christian enough for me. I have this idea in my mind as a Christian nationalist that if you are Christian and you are exactly in this road that I want you to be in, you are acceptable to us. But if you are any other denomination, you are problematic. So even Reverend Lamar's church, that was an historical AME church. AMEs came around because African Americans weren't allowed into white churches. Like we had to build our own churches because we were not allowed to pray together, to worship together, to express religion together. So the idea that, oh yeah, you know, race has nothing to do with it. It has always had something to do with it in the United States. And until we acknowledge that race has always had something to do with it, we will have a problem even thinking about religious freedom, because we're like, no, everybody has religious freedom. Oh, actually, when the founding fathers came, they didn't care about us. We were not in the plan. This was not the plan to, oh, everyone has religious freedom. White Christian male landowners had religious freedom. If you didn't fall into those groups, so if you were, you know, Jewish, you didn't fall into that group. If you were from, and it was not just white, it was white from a certain part of Western Europe. So for you guys who are Italian descent, anywhere else in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, we now say, oh, we're all white. But when it came into effect, you guys weren't considered white either. So we have to think of it as a construct that America has built up, and it's there now. So we can't just say, oh, we're going to ignore the construct. We're not going to talk about it, because that affects us always. And so it gets to religious pluralism, because people are so like, oh, well, I'm different. So what does that mean to be different? And as humans, we're all different. Even identical twins are different. So pluralism just goes to the religious expression and really respecting people's religious expression. I tell people all the time, like, I'm a Muslim, but I have respect for people who have any other kind of religious expression. I was like, some of my best friends are Christian. Some of my best friends are Jewish. I love being able to celebrate Yom Kippur with my Jewish friends. And I'm like, you understand what it's like for me fasting during Ramadan because you fasted a day. We have this in common. Or, you know, my friends who are Catholic who go through the Advent, you know, time of year right before Christmas. I'm like, that's similar to during Ramadan, and we do stuff every day, really making connections. And that's what pluralism is all about, is making connections with our fellow humans. And Dr. Walker talked about it. In this time of environmental crisis, we as humans need to look at each other as humans first. And too often with white Christian nationalism, you look at their humanity as the last thing you see. You focus on their race, you focus on their religion, you focus on what part of the country they're from, whether they're urban or in middle America, everything, you know, there's always something to define us. There, you know, I'm not a scientist, but 99% of our DNA is identical. It's the 1% that we spend so much time focused on and we have built our whole careers on is the 1%, but 99% of us is the same. And so when I think of religious pluralism, I think of the common humanity that we have. And, you know, my organization, KARAMAH means dignity, dignity for all human beings. And that's what we like to stress, is that dignity is not something that you can, oh, I like you, I'll give you dignity. Oh, you're male, I'll give you dignity. Oh, you are male from this background, I'll give you, or you believe the way I believe in the exact, because in every religious tradition, there are going to be sex differences. And it's like, if you don't believe exactly the way I believe and do things exactly the way I do, I'm not going to respect you. That's what Christian nationalism is saying. It's saying, if you are not this type of Christian, you're not good enough. If you don't believe everything I say you should believe, you know, you're on the outside. If you don't watch this type of news program and believe everything that they say is, you know, the gospel, because it's not even focused on the Bible. It's not focused on the Torah. That is not where they're getting this from. You're getting it from somebody who's doing it for, publicity. And so people need to really focus on why people are using religion now, because it's convenient. Religion now has become the convenient excuse of, okay, I'm going to use religion to get what I want. And that we should push back on that. It should not be, no, you're not going to use religion to justify what you're doing. And I think it's the hypocrisy of us as Americans, because the first thing we pointed out when the Taliban came back into control was talking about, oh my gosh, look, they're running all the Christians and the Jews, and they're doing all these bad things. And aren't we doing a version of that here? We're so focused on, oh, those people, those heathens, they're from another country and they do all. They're just watching what we did in January and saying, hey, we're taking it to a different level, but they are watching us. And so us really thinking that here in America, we have it figured out, we don't. And we have really shown that American democracy is a lot more fragile than we ever thought it was. And in this moment, we really need to focus on how fragile American democracy is, because if we don't focus on it now, in another year, we can only talk in code. We have to go underground because people, like, we're getting to that point where it's becoming, we can't talk about religious freedom unless we talk about it through the Christian nationalism lens, and we have to fight against that.
Rahmah, yes. Charles, it looked like you were going to jump in and say something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to jump in to say, part of us learning is sitting back and listening to voices like you and Rahmah. I think that's doing the book and just reading the book is understanding that we have so many resources here that we don't even tap into because we block them from being able to learn from them. That's the thing I've always loved about the differences that we have. Rahmah talked about the 1% difference in that, but that 1% shows so much value in the humanities. Those differences show so much value in the humanities. And I was going to jump in because we've seen what happens with this, and we don't have to talk about slavery or the Holocaust or those things, and those things were bad that happened. We can look at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We can see what Christian nationalism does. If you look at Dylan Roof's manifesto, it was filled with Christian nationalism, right? If we talk about Asian American and Pacific Islanders that are here in America, we can see the violence that happened against the Asian hate, the thing that happened in Georgia, the shooting. That was this man's idea of purity that was coming through, that made him want to go in here and shoot these people. So the idea of this, the total lie that has been a part of America, this Christian nation, not a Christian nation, right? It's not, we have a democracy. We don't have a theocracy. I mean, we got started at that line. Once we eat at all these lies, we can kind of chisel away at it. But we asked the question, well, why won't we just tell the truths about these lies? And I have a theory that comes in there. Y'all know my mind sometimes just goes to money. I mean, part of telling the truth would be reparations. Part of telling the truth to say, we can hide behind this God ordained thing, because if we acknowledge that we did these wrongs, then we have to pay for these wrongs. But if we say, no, this was God ordained, this is how it was supposed to be, then now we don't have to pay for these wrongs that we done, because we were just living by what God had. And that's the only reason we have this country, is because God ordained this country to be this way. And if you keep up with that lie, now you don't have to pay for the sins of that lie. And if you ever break that lie, then they realize the economic structure that is America can actually fall, because you're going to have reparations for the things that you've done. And so that's why it's such a stronghold on it. And it's crazy because there's a stronghold in two different levels. Classism is a stronghold. You have an elite class that wants to keep the stronghold because they don't want to share the wealth. You have a bottom class that doesn't want to eliminate the lie, because their self-worth is wrapped into being American. They don't have anything else but being American. So if you take that from them, then you're stripping everything that they have, and they hold humanity. And I wish they could see themselves as more than just Americans, because I mean, the idea of it's a little bit off with it. The idea that we call ourselves Americans, like we the only Americans. I mean, this is like we the only American, like Central America, South, no, Canadian, you're not American. We're all in America. So the idea of just even the basic lie of that. And so one of the things that we did at BJC is start this thing called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And the reason we did it, we tried to do it with a large community, but the large community said, wait a minute, no. First, we don't feel it was their responsibility, but there was also a fear that if they came out and said something against Christian nationalism, something would happen to them. So we have this thing called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, where you can sign on to our petition that is if you have the Christian faith and you don't believe in Christian nationalism, you can sign on to this. And we use these when we do our advocacy work. And again, I'll talk about that tomorrow with my colleague, Desire Masters, on how to use advocacy. But that is one step in using that. Final thing I'll say on that part of this conversation, because Rahmah, again, just listening to you and being around Dr. Dent all this time, there is a level of understanding race, there's a level of understanding faith, but there's also a level of gender that I can't see. And again, hearing from women of color, hearing from Black women, is a learning experience for everybody, and a learning experience that everybody needs if we're going to actually solve all of these problems that we have when it comes to Christian nationalism. When you separate everything, when you start thinking about our founding fathers, you can tell the people that they were not trying to hear from. Yet, when we listen to our Shirley Chisholm, our Fannie Lou Hamer, we have it, Diane Nash, all these, we have the power that comes from what you have for us. So I always want to acknowledge the fact that even when we have these conversations, I'm a part of these panels, I'm sitting here learning. And I wish other people would sit and value the education that I get to get all the time from knowing both of you and knowing our other friends that we talk to here. So there's value in listening. I don't go to this church anymore. My former pastor used to say, love seeks to understand, not to be understood. And when you start listening first and trying to understand without, I'm fighting against, and America has to learn that it's almost like if my mother lies to me, I'm just using this as this is not a gender thing. It's just me talking about my mom. If my mom lies to me, something's wrong about that. You know what I'm saying? Something's wrong, but I can't get over it if my mom lies to me, But if my mom has done something and she comes back and tells me, hey, son, this is what happened, I can recover from that. America, United States, if we look at America as our mother in that way, we can't continue to have it lie and then think everything's going to be okay. No, at some point in time, you got to tell the truth. So that's what I would say to our Christian nationalism brothers and sisters. Tell the truth, and then we can possibly heal. But if you continue to lie, then we're going to get into some places where we don't want to be. Because the retaliation or even the lie that you keep perpetuating is going to have those people actually doing violent things, as we've seen they've done throughout the history of this.
Thank you, Charles. So I want to go back to things that both of you have shared. So in the conversation around pluralism, Rahmah, you talked about understanding other people's religions and their religious identities, right? Because it's not just their religion, but everyone has their own religious identity. And I want to call into this moment the work of my former colleague and friend, Ben Marcus, who does this work around the 3 B's framework. He talks about the 3 B's are behavior, belief, and belonging. And in that, there's this understanding that people ascribe to different religious identities and beliefs for different reasons. For some, it may be about the beliefs, the doctrines, the sacred texts, For others, it might be about the rituals or the things that are the rites of passage that are a part of that community. And for others, it may just be about belonging. It may be about belonging to a community that might look like you, but you might not necessarily believe all that they believe, but you're a part of that community, maybe because they were there for you during a critical time in your life, where you may have lost a loved one or a time of celebration and they supported you. So it's important for people to realize that there are many different ways in which people identify religiously. And so let that person self-identify and say who they are as an individual. I often think about also, there's this, I shared this story when we did our class on African Americans and religious freedom with some of our colleagues that I see have joined us on this call and that are viewing today. Like I saw Dr. Sharon Grant is on with us, who was also one of the contributing scholars to the book, as well as a host of many others. But I was shared this conversation about when I was in South Africa, and my Uber driver, anyone who knows me knows I love Uber and Lyft because I don't really like driving around DC, but this happened in South Africa. And so my driver and I somehow ended up talking about religion, because it's not necessarily a conversation that I typically have in an Uber. But he shared with me that he was Catholic. He was from Zimbabwe and he was Catholic. But when he moved to South Africa, he attended the Catholic Church and realized that it wasn't familiar to him. The Pentecostal church was more familiar to him because religion is also embedded in culture. And so that for him to attend the Pentecostal church, he was familiar with the drums and the music and the feeling that they had in their worship service, whereas that was a different experience for him in the Catholic Church in South Africa. So again, you have to have people to self-identify and share their own reasoning for being a part of the communities in which they ascribe to. And then Charles, you mentioned the entanglement, right, of everything, and Dr. Corey talked about that earlier, about the competing sovereignties. And so I want to raise this particular text because we reference it in the book, but the book Religious Freedom, The Contested History of an American Ideal by Tisa Winger. She is a professor of history at Yale University. And so in this book, she wrote, I begin this book with questions about the kinds of cultural work that diverse articulations of religious freedom perform. And she said, rather than asking how adequately Americans had achieved this freedom or how rapidly it has advanced, she said queries that assume that we already know what it is and how to measure it, right? And she continued to say she wanted to know who appealed to religious freedom and for what purposes and what it meant to them. And so in that, she talks about how there is this entanglement with race and religion that happens, as we've talked about here today. And so we continued by saying that to be sure that based on the conversations that are happening that include Christian nationalism, that religious freedom is not neutral. It is not neutral, and that religious freedom has been entangled in American politics. And so there's a lot that we still have to address. And so later on today, you will hear from one of our panelists, Dr. Keisha McKenzie, who did a report with Columbia Law School that talks about the six points that are critical to understanding religious freedom for all people. That's people of all faiths and none. And so I think it's important in this conversation that people really start to see how we need to dismantle the traditional narratives, because some people still, as you mentioned, some people still ascribe to those, but there needs to be this dismantling. There needs to be an understanding of historically, and Rahmah brought this up, right? But the fact that enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas and dispersed across to the different countries and to the different continents, including Asia, that these individuals, 30% of enslaved Africans that were brought here identified as Muslims. Muslim. They came with their own traditions. They came with their own cultures. There were those that actually practiced African spirituality. So we need to keep that in mind when we're having these conversations about religious freedom in this country. The last question that I want to ask both of you is, what happens if we stop talking about this? Like, what happens if, if today we stop talking about this, if we stop disrupting the narrative, if we stop raising healthy questions, right? Because this healthy sense of curiosity, but in this moment of truth-telling and courageous conversations, what happens if we stop doing this? What would our nation look like?
Well, I'll start. There's quite a few things that will kind of implode. Just thinking about, since yesterday was Veterans Day, just thinking about our military around the world. I can just imagine what would happen to our military in different parts of the world if we stop respecting other cultures here in the United States. Why would they even acknowledge us and be like, no, you're not coming over to colonize us? Because right now, as we're in different countries, we're helping you out. We're trying to bring democracy. We're trying to stabilize the region. That's what we use in our military thought process now. If we don't keep on these conversations about religious freedom, people are going to realize, like, are you guys really trying to help us out? Or are you coming to colonize and take our resources? And for us to not think about that long term, we don't live in, we're not an island that, no one can get to. We have military bases around the world. And we have to think about our military members around the world who are here saying, we are Americans, but we are just trying to help you with democracy. We're trying to keep you safe. Instead, they're gonna be like, no, you're trying to bring your ideas of what you believe is correct to us. And that's what happened during the colonization time. That's what England was so good on, like the sun never sets on, the whole kingdom of England, because they were around the world talking about their ideas about the Church of England and what they were spreading around. I think that would be the first thing that's affected. And then here in the United States, we take for granted a lot of things. I think a lot of things we take for granted. And I know that I take for granted the ability to go to my masjid whenever I want to. I take for granted the idea that I can talk to fellow people about religion. I take for granted being able to go to a university and study religions and different religions and learn about different things. I take that all for granted. I think that if we stop talking about it, we will have, okay, we can only have these certain types of schools. Okay, these Christian denominations are acceptable. You think you're a Christian, but we don't really think you're a Christian, so you're not acceptable. We will really have a lot of people going underground trying to be like, oh, that's not what I believe because, I need to keep my job. Because it'll come to the point where religion will become kind of the like, okay, do you believe in these things? If you believe in these things, you're okay. If you don't believe in these things, there's something wrong with you. And the way we, the hypocrisy of America talking about what's happening in China, that could happen here based on Christian nationalism. China might be focused on communism, but we could do the same thing here in the United States and putting people in concentration camps and trying to tell them like, oh, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to believe. We like to believe that that wouldn't happen in the United States, but we did put our Japanese brothers and sisters in camps during World War II because we didn't believe that they were American enough. And that's what happened with Christian nationalism, because it's not just Christian nationalism. And I think a lot of my African-American brothers and sisters who are Christians need to realize that Christian nationalism, they're not always talking about you either. Just because you think that, oh, we're all Christians together and we'll be on the safe side. Nah, don't think that they already coming for you guys. They're coming for you guys. I tell my fellow Muslims all the time, I'm like, why are you guys adopting these kind of white Christian views about how religion is expressed? Because y'all know that when it comes down to it, you know how they treat us. We have experienced, like for my community, I have experienced it my entire life, but I have some Muslim friends who didn't experience it until after 9/11. And then we're shocked when people start, the whole anti-Sharia legislation that came up after 9/11. You think that's just going to be the starting point. They're going to be talking, I mean, really, my Jewish brothers and sisters, you know, a lot of the Christian nationalism, they're nice to you to an extent. And then they're like, but you guys killed Jesus. I mean, come on, like, we need to think about, it's going to go back to that point. And that's what a lot of the Christian nationalists really, I know some people are like, you're exaggerating, you're going too far. It's like, no, that is their endpoint. Their endpoint is having a country that looks like them and everyone else in the place that they think we should be. And so if we don't push back and say, no, you're not in charge. And we have to do that now because it's only going to get worse. It's going to be similar to during times of slavery when there were so many more slaves than there were slaveholders, but people were like, how did they keep control? The same thing is going to happen here in the United States because the number of people who are not white and Christian, it's turning, the tide is turning. And what they're trying to do right now is keep hold on their power. That's the beauty of capitalism. They're trying to keep hold of their power in the elite. And we have to push back saying, no, we need to be able to share the power. We need to have more people in the circle talking about it. So I feel it's a very dismal future if we don't keep on talking about it, because we need to keep on talking till, you know, we can't talk anymore and then pass the baton to someone else to talk about it, because this is that serious. It's like people thought that January 6th was something. It can happen again on a larger scale. The fact that so few people died, a lot more people could die if we don't really continue to talk about this.
Thank you, Rahmah. And I appreciate your remarks because it brings up, you know, the thought that, you know, you talk about what could happen and that there are already things that are happening, right, in terms of discrimination in hiring practices, which is why public schools is a concern, and funding the voucher programs is a major issue because you're taking money from public schools and then putting it towards private religious education, which can discriminate against people if they don't have the same religious beliefs that they have as far as that institution. Also could discriminate against a student based on the way they need to learn. And so there are protections in place for public schools that are not at those private schools. And so there have been cases where that has happened. And it's also why I raised the piece of legislation that was introduced, and I know everyone has different opinions on it, but the piece of legislation that was introduced in September 15th by Senator Cory Booker, which is the Do No Harm Act, which is a piece of legislation that is saying that we want to make sure that religion is not being used to discriminate or cause harm against people, which is what we talked about at the top of this conversation. And I think that is so important when we think about the many ways in which that can show up. And how religion has been and continues to be used to discriminate against other individuals. And so I appreciate that you talked about and the realness of this moment and the critical nature of having the conversations, and for people of faith, of all faiths, right, to weigh in and reimagine and rethink the conversations that they're having about religion and religious freedom in ways that affirm the human dignity of every person. And so I saw, and Charles, I'll have you jump in also, is that I see there was a comment in the chat by Mark Davis who said, we in the church also must examine our attitudes towards other faiths, especially in the Black church. And he said, our attitudes, our faith, our theology needs to be examined. And so I think that is important to think about, like the ways in which people engage. And Dr. Smallwood brought this up on yesterday's conversation and talking about how the theologies that have been adopted within some Black church communities that dehumanize people that identify as LGBTQ individuals. And so I think it's important that we have these conversations, because that then is a way of enacting a supremacy, right? Like that is the same notion that, oh, you matter, but not this part of you. But if we're having this conversation about religious freedom and reframing the conversation, then we have to consider the humanity and the human dignity of every person, their right to live, their right to thrive, their right to be and to exist and to have access to resources that allow them to sustain their families, their livelihoods, and the ways in which they choose to show up in the world. And I think that's a very important conversation that is not had very often. And I do know people that are having those conversations, but it needs to be elevated even more. So Charles, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? I know Rahmah put it so eloquently and so fiercely, so fiercely stated too.
Yeah. I would say, and Rahmah, please stop me if I'm not. I would put what Rahmah said is that's the ultimate end of what it'll be. But before we get there, it looks like, federal judges being put in place and 226 of them being put in place and only 9 of them being Black. It looks like women's health care being dominated by white male Christians that only think about the things that they were taught when they was a little kid in Sunday school. It looks like yesterday. It looks like the trial in Georgia, in Brunswick, where you have a council that would stand up and say we don't need any more Black pastors coming in. So if they were white pastors, would it have been okay? But that's your idea of what Black pastors are. That's your idea of the value and what they do. And to throw out names and just say those things to try to scare. That's what happens. If you stop talking about it, then people are freely able to continue to do that type of stupidity and get away with it when you don't talk about it. So we have an obligation, not only as people of faith, but people that go to church or go to a synagogue, go to a mosque, any of those places, people that practice a faith tradition. We have a obligation to keep speaking on these things. We have an obligation to listen to our atheists and humanist brothers and sisters, because we don't have it all right. And if we were dropped in on this planet from another place and somebody just was like, okay, here's what people of faith have done, and here's what people not of faith have done. I mean, most people would be like, I'm gonna go to people that ain't got this idea of this God, because my goodness, y'all have done some stupid stuff and continue to do stupid stuff. So we have to talk about it. Not talking about it leads to the destruction that Rahmah said. And it happens on jury duty. I was upset the other day. I was listening to somebody talk about, I got jury duty. And again, I'm human. I understand it, but you have to understand that if we don't go to jury duty, then there's people that look like us that are left out there by themselves for these Christian nationalists to use their power to do whatever they want to do. And that was, I'm gonna circle back around to January 6th. That's what was so tragic about January 6th to me, is that people didn't understand, oh, these are these crazy people out here, that's only a segment of them. Most of them out there were voters. Most of them out there are registered. Most of them out there are on jury duty. So if they're able to do that and act like that, what do you think they're gonna do when they have an opportunity to see somebody that looks like me, or looks like Rahmah, or looks like anybody else, and I say look like Rahmah just because, wearing of the religious head. What do you think they're gonna do when they're in these places? What do you think they're gonna do when they're on city council? They're gonna use that power against us. So I hate when people say, oh, it's just a small community of those people. No, those people, I don't care if you're white. I don't care if it's a small community. You got power and leverage with that small community. All right. And so we have to talk about these things and not be afraid to talk about these things. Last thing I'll say is, I've said this before, Sabrina, you've heard me say it. A lot of us have allies, and that's fun. You can be an ally. And we have advocates, and that's I need accomplice. I need people that are, and Rahmah, you being an attorney, you understand that when you're accomplice to a crime or accomplice to something, you're getting the same punishment as the person that did it. if you're an ally to something, you can be like, yeah, you know, I'm an ally today, but that's too far for me tomorrow. We need more people that are willing to be accomplices in these conversations and in these acts. Want you to be able to take the punishment, take the brunt of what we're doing with us, and then we'll get further. Again, I applaud the people that are allies. I applaud the people that are advocates, but we need more accomplices, I think I'm saying that right, in that way, to be able to fight through this. And you can't be quiet and be an accomplice. You have to be seen. You got to be a part of it. I don't care if you're just driving the getaway car. I need you in this thing that we're doing and being all in it.
Yes, being all in the fight. That's what moral leadership should look like, you know, taking risk for the betterment, the greater good of everyone. And so I want to bring it back to this before we have like just a few more minutes before we'll transition to the Q&A. So I see there are some questions that have come in the chat. If anyone has a question, please feel free to put your question in the chat, or if you want to reserve it for the small group discussions where we'll be with you, we can do that as well. But I can't emphasize enough what you all have talked about as far as January 6th, because there were so many images that we saw initially, and then we know that the news cycle, the mainstream media, started showing us some other videos, right? And so I want people to remember what happened in that chamber. Right? Once they were in the chamber, what did they do? They started praying to the God that they believed in. And so there were Christians that do not ascribe to those beliefs that were appalled by what they were seeing. And so that's why we have to continue to have these conversations and disrupt the narratives about religious freedom and really get a deeper understanding of how Christian nationalism is showing up. Also, I want to mention this, like we know I'm the state of Virginia, so the newly elected governor that will take office soon, even, you know, in his platform, he said he was running on his faith and said that he was going to emphasize school choice. And so again, school choice is very coded. Remember, discrimination, that the voucher systems were established to defy desegregation orders in the 50s and 60s. So you have to keep those things in mind, looking at history and what is happening today, and keeping in mind that the little bit of funding that you get into it from that voucher, right, does not cover the full cost of education for your child to go to school for that year. And it doesn't help every child. But if you put it in public schools, then you do. And then the last thing I want to say is, because you touched on this, Charles, you touched on atheists, Black atheists, right? The atheist and free thinking community. I want to share, I'm going to share a link in the chat, because our friends at the secular society, American Atheists, they basically did a survey about Black atheists, about being Black and non-religious. And I think it's important for people of faith to really get a deeper understanding of the experiences of people of color and Black people that ascribe to being non-religious or secular, because there is a high rate of depression among that community, because they're often ostracized, and in many cases, they're isolated from their community. When I mean their community, I'm talking about their cultural and racial communities are the ones that are targeting them because of the beliefs that they have that are not rooted in any type of faith or religious identity. And I think it's important for people to have a deeper understanding of that and the impact that happens, especially when there are young people who are impacted by that as well. And that also goes for the LGBTQ community. The survey was very revealing of the experiences of Black atheists, and also their experiences with their families and the communities that surround them, that in many cases they were around religious communities. So it's important to take a look at that data. So I know that we've said a lot, and it's now 11:15. So I do want to open it up for questions. And I will look, if you give me a moment, I will look at the chat because I am trying to multitask and, and send you this link. Before we do you have any concluding thoughts, Rahmah or Charles?
I just wanted to, it really shouldn't be this funny, but it was amazing that you gave us a history lesson on school choice and stuff. And like, how did you learn that? You didn't learn that in school, did you? Because, you know, they're not teaching certain things in school because, you know, teaching true history in school would just be the worst thing that could ever happen to people. And, you know, we get that too. I mean, y'all know I'm talking about critical race theory, even though it's never been taught in those type schools, but the idea and the scariness of it, and it shows how deep and entrenched this lie of America is, that to tell the truth is scary for them. To even have somebody have thinking about this is scary for a lot of people. But yet without it, we start doing the same things, and without it, we have people that look like us defending school choice in that way and not even knowing the history of it. I think Rahmah, when we were having a conversation the other day, brought this up. If you don't know the history of stuff, you'll find yourself doing the same thing, using the same ideology. And, you know, y'all in there with me the other day. I'm not going to say the word I said to y'all, but yeah, I just need us to be a little more, I need people to be a little more creative. You know, even our people that are against being woke now, you know, like, wait a minute, can you come up with another word? You know, Black people have used that word to empower and do these things. Now it's the worst thing. And I think it's just an example of anything that we touch or we try to do with empowerment, it always gets turned into a negative thing. And if you just keep watching the history of that, you'd be like, oh, this is the same blueprint that they've done for years over and over again. And the reason that it's the same blueprint is because we don't teach that blueprint, because they know if we taught it, then more people wouldn't be susceptible to it. And so it's a continuous cycle of feeding each other in that. And that's the same thing with religion. That's the same thing with the policies that we put in. You know, they take advantage of the not knowing. And I guess I'm going back to the point of that's why we got to keep speaking, because the more of us that know these things, the more we can go through there. And I'll hush so we can get to the chat questions and things in there.
Yes. Well, thank you, Charles. I appreciate you raising that, because that's a very important point for individuals to be aware of. Again, it goes back to education, and that goes back to our responsibility to be engaged on civic conversations and issues that are happening in our local community, and on the and this is my own conviction, right? My own conviction is lately, because I have a school-age child, thinking about what role do I play even more, right? In terms of the public school system and the engagement beyond watching the school board meetings and beyond, and I say watching because we're all virtual with those meetings these days, and then being a part of the PTA. What is my responsibility in addition to what I'm already doing? And the last thing I want to mention is that it is American Atheists that did the survey about Black atheists. And so I've put that in the chat. So one, I will entertain two of the questions here, and then allow for us to go to the small group discussions. For those of you that have joined us today, we will be breaking you off into small groups to have conversations, because we realize that, you know, sometimes it's important for us to have more intimate conversations around these issues that might be a little heavy for some of us to unpack in this moment. So we want to give you the space to do that. And once we resume, once we end the small group discussions, then we'll come back into the big room, and then I'll share with you the agenda for the rest of today. So one of the questions that we have is, someone asked, when folks speak about shields, how are folks using religion as a shield?
Well, since I use the terminology, I'll answer that. When I talk about using it as a shield, it's a shield of protection for how I'm going about my day. So for me, my religion is the shield of how I feel protection. Like, I know this is something I'm sharing with you guys. I have road rage issues. So I constantly pray before I get in the car to not go off on someone. I feel that my religion is a shield that, you know, for me, Allah will protect me on my drive because I have prayed before I've gotten in the car. I know my my things that I have. And I'm like, okay. So when I say shield, I say it's as a personal shield that you can use to help you get through your day, to help you get through your life. That's how I see religion as a shield, is that people use this as a way of connecting with a higher power, trying to figure out where they are in the world, what it means to be who they are. That's what I say is a shield. When I say it's a sword, it's I'm a Muslim, and because I'm a Muslim and you are not, I don't like the way you do that. I'm cutting out Christmas, even though I like having the day off. I'm cutting out all of what I consider the Jewish holidays, because those people, I'm cutting all of those out. The only thing you get to do is things that I say Muslims can do. And because you're not a Muslim, then you don't get these special things that Muslims get. And so that's what I say when it's used as a sword. It's kind of used like, if you're not one of us, then you don't get these special things. So you don't get the same type of food. You know, like all food has to be halal. If it's not halal, I'm putting you out of business, farmers, because you are not raising halal chickens. Or, you know, like, so that's what I'm saying. The difference for me for sword and shield, and, you know, Dr. Watson might have another thought, but my thought is that it is a personal shield. It's a community shield. And the sword is when you're trying to use it to cut off other people.
Robert, if we were talking about personally, I would say it the same way. Organizationally, we use it in that term of saying, hey, if I wouldn't want this to happen to my religion, I shouldn't ask it to be done to somebody else's religion. If I wouldn't want my religion talked about, or I wouldn't want somebody else's religion promoted over mine, I shouldn't promote mine over somebody else's. So that way is a shield of protection so that all of us are protected organizationally. That's how we use it at BJC, to kind of say, you know, whatever we're using to say, hey, we wouldn't want this to happen to us, that shield has to be big enough for every community to block that somebody would sort of from every community doing that. But personally, Rahmah, yes, I agree with you totally.
Thank you both for that response. And I think it's important for us to think about religion in a way that protects everyone. And I know I personally, it's a part of the fabric of my advocacy work and what I do and how I show up in these conversations. I often say, I do this work thinking about the people that I say I love and I care for, and that I say are my friends and my family, that means something to me. I want to make sure that their right to practice, their right to believe or not to believe is protected. And one of the ways in which it showed up for us in the work that we did on the African Americans and Religious Freedom Project, and even in the course, is that every year we paid attention to who's missing from the table, right? It was like, we needed to make sure that we had multiple voices that were a part of the conversation. And so, you know, so Rahmah was one of the individuals that was on a panel that we hosted, as well as our friends from the U.S. Baha'is Office of Public Affairs. May and PJ were a part of those conversations, because I wanted people in the room to understand that, one, African Americans are not a monolith. Every African American is not a Christian, and that everyone shows up in the world differently, but we all have something that we can bring to the collective in the conversation. And so it's one of the reasons also why that we have partnered on several occasions with our friends at Black Nonbelievers, because again, as Charles said, communities of faith do not have all the answers. No one has all the answers. And so we have to make sure that we're in dialogue and asking healthy questions respectfully to engage and get a deeper sense and understanding of why that person believes what they believe. Or as Dr. Walter Fluker framed it, and I use this in my work, he asked the question, who are the characters in the plot of your narrative? So when I usually teach for my course, I ask people the question, how do you enter into the conversation? Like, what shaped your beliefs about race and religious freedom? And I think it's important for us to think about that. And as we sit with those answers, to then start to think about someone else's experience and then reimagine how we move forward together. So that, for me personally, that's one of the ways in which I use my spirituality, because I identify as spiritual, although I have a strong foundation in the Pentecostal tradition, I simply identify as spiritual, that I still use that to affirm the human dignity and worth of every person and to protect their right to live and to thrive, as I stated before. So another question that we have, and then we'll transition to the small group at 11:30, and then after that, you'll have about 20 minutes in the small chat. So we ask that everyone is courteous and give space for those that want to share. So if you ask one question, then leave space for another person to ask a question in the chat. So one of the questions that was raised was about the vaccine. And so the question pretty much ask, what is the difference? They're basically saying, how is the freedom of choice around vaccines different from having freedom of choice regarding abortion rights? Freedom over our bodies with what? And so I have a response for that, but I want to hear from one of you to respond to that question.
I'll respond. I'll save you this time, Reverend Watson. I saw the look like, I am not touching that. I will say that it is hilariously funny to me as you know, Dr. Dent introduced me. I am a practicing attorney. You know, I do understand the legally, but trying to use religion autonomy or body integrity as the reason why they can't get a vaccine, I think is very interesting, because again, they're starting to use religion as a code word. So I don't want to get it because of my political, you know, association, but I can't say that. So instead I'm going to say religious. And that is what has been used, is that people are like, well, for my religion, I'm like, so wait a second, but your kids are in public school and they had to get all the vaccines to go to public school, or you're in the military, you got all these vaccines, and it's really a new version, as Dr. Watson said, of the same story. So before we got to use other words, and now those are not acceptable. So now what is acceptable to say is using religious freedom, because this is the first time in the history of this country that we have a vaccine that has become a religious issue. There's always been certain groups who really seriously were like, from the very beginning, they took nothing. They don't take Tylenol. They take, you know, they're just like, my body is my temple. I'm not going to take anything. Those are not the people we're talking about. We're talking about people who take medicine for everything else, who have cancer and take chemotherapy drugs, you know, like they take everything else. But this one thing, now all of a sudden, my body autonomy, and I don't like, it really comes down to the ideas of federalism, and now everything is socialist policies because you're mandates. You know, it's really kind of our American theology that we love this whole idea that we have all these freedoms. And one of the issues is that we don't realize the limits of our freedoms. And we don't want to ever acknowledge that there are any limits. And because we don't want to acknowledge that there are any limits, the idea that someone can tell me you can't go back to school until you're vaccinated is problematic. And I really want people to understand that it's a dog whistle. Hearing people talk about, you know, religious autonomy, about vaccines is another dog whistle, because certain groups like to hear it. And funny enough, the media that's using this as a dog whistle, everybody there is vaccinated. So they're using it against people who they know are easily manipulated to tell them, like, don't get vaccinated, while they themselves are vaccinated.
I would add this again. The reason we're making that face is because I'm here with two women, and I would make sure that you guys answer that. I'm gonna use some country grammar to try to understand this. Okay, for me, the difference in the two is what you eat don't make me go to the restroom. Like, and I say that in that way. Like, my rights to tell you what you do with your body don't come into play unless what you're doing with your body affects me. All right. So what you're doing with your body in my eyes, and this is just my opinion, as a woman that decides that they want to have an abortion for whatever reason, it's none of my business what the reason is. Because guess what? That abortion does not, or that medical procedure does not affect me. I cannot touch that in any way. It does not affect me. So I'm the type of person that says, if it doesn't affect me, that means I have less say so on what you do in that way. With the vaccine, I can see somebody see the difference, because people could say, hey, you not taking the vaccine can affect somebody else. And you both know that I'm plant-based, so I watch what I put in my body. So I am very open to, people thinking about what they're putting in their body. But to answer that question, I see it very simplistically in the act of, that does not affect my body, what you do if that woman has an abortion. If you don't take the vaccine, that could affect somebody else. So you don't have the jurisdiction or the same level. It's apples to oranges trying to compare those two. And I will go ahead and say this too while I'm sitting here with it. That's the same way I feel about marriage equality. That's the same way I feel about everybody else. I don't care who you sleep with. That's you. It doesn't affect me. So why am I trying to legislate what you do in your bedroom? I don't care. It does not affect me. That's just how I see it, my little country self.
Thank you, Charles. So as we transition, I think about the quote by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said that your rights end where another person's rights begin, right? So that's where I sum that up. You have the right, but when it comes to public health and how it impacts another individual, then that's something that you really need to think about. So with that, we're going to go into the breakout rooms. We'll be there until 11:52 now. And since we went over by a few minutes to still give 20 minutes. So you will be assigned to a breakout room, and we'll see you back shortly. Thank you for joining us again. So I hope that opportunity to be in a small group gave each one of you the opportunity to really ask questions or to reflect on some of the things that you were introduced to during today's conversation. I know in the group that I was in, I felt like we had some powerful reflections and thoughts that were shared by those participants. And it's important for us to think about the ways in which we show up in this work. Welcome back for those of you that are still joining us. I was just saying how these small group discussions are so important for us to reflect on the ways in which we show up in conversations and how we can relate to them based on our lived experiences. And so the conversation in my group was very powerful. And I hope that if you connected with someone in your small group, that you will connect with that person and see throughout the conference and maybe thereafter too. But to that, I in our small group, I wanted to reflect on this, and Rahmah and Reverend Watson, if you want to, share any thoughts that stood out to you in the conversation, I invite you to do so, or anyone else that wants to before we wrap up. But one of the things that I wanted to bring back to the larger group in the conversations around religious freedom, public schools, separation of religion and government. Often some people hear church and state, but that makes it very limited as well. But the fact that there is, because we talked about truth and lies earlier, right? And so there is this myth that a lot of people have that says prayer was taken out of schools, right? And so prayer was never taken out of schools. Basically, the separation of religion and government states that no government official, that includes a public school teacher, a public school educator, can participate in a football coach, right? Cannot lead any religious activities with the students. students can pray. Like students, and Reverend Watson has said this many times, he said, as long as there are math tests in schools, there will be some praying. So the reality of it is that to keep that separation of religion and government, that you have to make sure that government actors, government representatives are not participating in those activities. Students can do so. Also, another thing to be mindful of that is important, going back to the conversation around local responsibilities and public schools and the ways in which it supports people of all religious identities and none, is that we have to keep in mind, like school calendars. Like, does your local public school have a school calendar that allows for children that are non-Christian to then take days off without penalty to them? And as I said to the smaller group, like if the school calendar only includes Christian holidays, and there's a child that practices a different tradition, like recently Diwali was celebrated, and also there were Jewish holy days that were observed. Are the schools allowing room in their schedules for those children to take the days off without penalty? Because if a teacher has a test that's scheduled for the day in which the child observes their holy day, then that presents, and the teacher says there's no retake, then that presents a problem for the child that then suggests that, you know, they're being penalized because of their religious beliefs and how they practice their religion. So that's something that people should keep in mind as we move forward in doing this work. I don't know, Rahmah or Dr. Watson, Reverend Watson, you're getting elevated today, Charles. So we're speaking that PhD into existence for you. So.
You speaking somebody paying for it? Are you speaking somebody paying for it? Because that's the only way it's going to happen, player. But yeah, I would say in my group, and I wanted to clarify something that was brought up to me in my group. When I said my country grammar of baseline of if it doesn't affect me, then that's my baseline. That's where I start the conversation. That doesn't mean the conversation ends there, because somebody brought it into my attention. Well, if somebody is murdered in China and is far away from me, since it didn't affect me, did it affect me? And it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that's where I start with my baseline of any conversation of saying, okay, how close is to me? Should I be speaking to this? And if I'm speaking to this, am I speaking to this from a place of I'm adding something to this conversation that somebody else hasn't said, or somebody else that isn't more qualified to speak to this situation than me? So when I speak about abortion, I take the back seat to the women that are in the room. But I also know that I could be in a situation where, you know, somebody I'm with decides to have an abortion, and now I'm closer to that situation. So it changes the dynamic of what I'm saying. But I wanted to just clarify that for everybody else in that, and we should all say. I also wanted to just say in our group, we talked about a little bit of freedom, and what does that freedom mean? Freedom to and freedom for. We talked about a little bit of the vaccination aspect of people if when they get to the point where they'll lose their job because of it. That is a tough call, and sometimes we have to stand on those things. And I'll say it in this way, and this is I'm gonna try to say it legally, even though I'm not a legal person. You know, because you lose your job, or because you make a decision that causes you not to be able to do the things you want to do, doesn't mean that you've lost all freedom. You know, that means that you have the freedom to go somewhere else. You have the freedom to do this. It is a tough decision, though, and we need to be able in conversation with those people that would say that. And again, let me just, I'm using Kyrie Irving for example, the basketball player. If you're willing to lose millions, I'm gonna listen to you. Like, I ain't got to agree with you, but I'm gonna respect the fact that, hey, if you feel this strongly about something in that way, then the conversation, we have to be open to that conversation. Not to say we have to agree, not to say that we have to do exactly that, but if somebody feels that strongly about that stuff in that way, I think we shouldn't just blackball people or whitewash people or do these things. So we have to find a place to have these conversations. And that's why I'm glad, Dr. Dent, you're opening this stuff up for people so that we can have these small group conversations and have more of them, so that we can get a little more interpersonal instead of talking about it like it's somebody far away. And we have these conversations that are right here, and not seek to always trying to change, but understanding what's going on in that dynamic. I think that's important. And our group was talking about it.
Thank you so much, Charles. And Rahmah, if you wanted to share any thoughts from your group, and I do understand if people have to go exactly at 12, but I'll give the agenda after Rahmah gives these final remarks from her group or thoughts.
So the one thing that came up that I thought was like really fascinating is that one of the people in our group mentioned that a lot of things talked about control. And I think that that's what we really need to talk about with Christian nationalism, that it goes back to power and control of who has power and control currently in the United States, and really talking about it from that lens of religious freedom is being talked about as a dog whistle and to continue power and control. And really, when we think about it from that lens, it's no longer like, oh, that's something that everyone has. It's okay, does everyone have it or just certain groups have it? And so we started talking about that and really kind of getting into what Christian nationalism is about. So I just want to stop there because I know that we're over time, but really talking about Christian nationalism from a point of power and control and how it affects others.
Thank you so much, Rahmah. Join me in thanking Rahmah and Charles Watson for joining us for today's conversation. You can do the little emojis in the chat or reactions that you have. Feel free to do whatever your reaction is, right? I just want you to join me in thanking them for being a part of this conversation. I also want to thank Dr. Corey Walker, who had to leave us early for another obligation, as well as I want to thank Dr. Teresa Smallwood in her absence, because we're having this conversation today because she saw the critical nature of us talking about religious freedom as a part of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And just to remind you, here's the agenda for this afternoon. So we're going to take a break now through 12:45. At 12:45, join us for a musical performance. It is a recorded performance because they were not available to join us live today, but we have a musical performance that we'll share with you at 12:45. And then we'll come back at 1 o'clock is when we'll start the next session, when religious freedom imposes on our right to live. The things that we talked about today, you're going to actually hear from people that are on the ground, that are doing the work. And these two here that are with me now, they're doing the work, and we'll have others that are joining that are in many fights across the country. And so we look forward to that conversation happening. After that, there will be a 5-minute break in between that, a 5 to 10 minute break between that and the final session today, which is at 3:15, which is titled Position to Make Change and Take Action. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this morning conversation. And I want to, again, as you see on the screen, thank our partners, the BJC, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, the Center for Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, KARAMAH, which Rahmah is the executive director of, and the Henry Luce Foundation for generously supporting this event through resources. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at 12:45 or 1 o'clock. So thank you, and have a great lunch break.